name is Kate Ryan.
I'm Emma Ryan.
I'm Anna Ryan. We are here in Frigtop to interview our granduncle, Philip Ryan. Now we are going to ask him some questions about his memories long ago.
He was the principal in Boherlahan National School for 40 years.
He started in 1948 and retired in 1988. What games did you play? Can you give a list?
Yes, I'll have to start with hurling, because hurling was always the main game in Boherlahan, particularly when I was young. Because when I was young, remember, the Boherlahan was one of the most famous teams, not alone in Tipperary, but in Ireland. So we all played hurling. But we had other games as well. Now, we played very little football, because you see, we couldn't afford a football in those days. There was no such thing as plastic footballs, but so we concentrated always on hurling.
Did you amuse yourself in a special way at certain times of the year?
Yeah, during holiday times, in the evenings, particularly in the summer evenings. And we had a whole lot of games we played. We played Hunt the Fox and all that, and we played Conkers in the autumn when the Conkers were there. And we often went around, we had great fun. We'd go up to places like Killock, collecting nuts. Killock was a great place where nuts grew. The whole place was covered with trees, and you come back with bagfuls of nuts. And these are the principal games that we played then.
Do you remember any games played around the fire in the evenings or other games afterwards?
Well, yeah. Let's see now. Well, there were other games, particularly when the young fellas grew older. There was a famous game that used to play then was called Skittles. And Skittles was a very well-known game. You put little pegs around the ground and you threw a bigger kind of a timber piece at it, you see, and you tried to knock out the Skittles. That was a very well-known game. And of course, when people got older, they played a game that they called pitch and toss. Now, you played that with pennies. You threw up a penny, couple of pennies, and if you got two heads, or maybe a head and a harp, or two harps, and they were used to bet on that. And only recently, somebody was telling me that down there near his house, every Sunday during the whole summer, every Sunday, there'd be 50 or 100 people. There was a shop nearby, and they'd all collect there on a Sunday afternoon playing pitch and toss.
By what name is your home district known as? What townsland in which parish?
Well, of course, it's in Boherlahan, and the townsland is Castlemoyle. And you're living still in Castlemoyle, so Castlemoyle was a great place for the Ryans. It's called Castlemoyle after an old castle that was down across from in Castlemoyle, just across from the graveyard in Ardmail. And the name of the castle was Boherlahan Moyle, or was Boherlahan Moyle, the Bear Castle, because shortly after it had been built, there was a big war between the local factions, and the castle was burned down, and the roof was burnt off, and of course it was bare, no roof on it, no head, and it was like a man without any hair, and it was called Boherlahan Moyle.
Were there a great number of families in this townsland when you were young?
Well, Emma, not more than I say than there is today. Castlemoyle is a small, if you like, area, and with very little, if you like, coming to the road, and so you never had any great developments there. There's probably as many houses there today as was there when I was a young fella. There are some of the houses are gone, and only a small number of houses, your daddy's house and Anna's daddy's house, and very few houses after that, so very little change there.
What were the most common family names then?
Well, I suppose it is still the most common family name today, and that's your name and my name, Ryan. After that, I'd say O'Dwyer's. Dwyer's would be a fairly common name too, and after that I'd say Mahers. Now, they would be the three commonest names around here. Now, strange enough, at the present time, there's a lot of names that we never heard of before, of people coming into the parish now. You'd know them in school, but They weren't there in my time, but the principal, in my time, the principal names were Rhines, Dwyers and Mahers.
What types of houses were they? Were they detached or slated?
Oh, mostly thatched. Mostly thatched in my young days. Even though, I suppose, back in the early 1900s, when I was a tiny tot, I suppose slated houses were becoming a little more popular with the people. But before that time, I'd say in my father's and my grandfather's time, practically all the houses were thatched houses. The only houses that weren't thatched in were the big houses where the gentry lived, but all the others were thatched houses.
Were there any old people living near you when you were a child? Any who spoke Irish?
Well, I'd say at that time it was mostly English, because you see, when they were going to school, when my father was going to school, he couldn't speak. He wasn't allowed to speak Irish. You see, the English laws, when they were young, the English laws were there, forbade the people in the school to speak Irish at all. And the English laws, they killed off the Irish. And so when we won our independence back in the 1920s, there wasn't any Irish spoken. And it wasn't until about 1924, a few years before I was born, about 1924, that the Irish government, because there was now an Irish government there, and they ruled that Irish would have to be taught again in the schools.
Did people immigrate when you were a child?
Oh yeah, immigration. Immigration was there for about 150 years. The first immigrants after the famine, they went off to America. That's where they immigrated to. That's why there's so many Irish Americans there now. They went off over in the 1800s. After that, and sometimes they went as far away as Australia. In later years, the people who went to school with me, when they were young, they immigrated to England, because after the war in England, the work was easy to be got, rebuilding the cities that were all destroyed, London and Birmingham and all these cities in England, they were all destroyed during the war, and the Irish fellas, they went over, and it was they built up the cities again after the war.
Rivers, lakes, streams, any stories connected with them?
Streams. Well, there are lots of streams and rivers, and there's probably a lot of stories. But I'll tell you a good story about Ardmail. This happened many, many years ago when the gentry used to go chasing the hunt. And it was a winter's day, and there was a big flood down in the river in Ardmail. And the fox came down across the fields and down by the river, and he jumped into the river and he swam to the other side, and the hounds all jumped in after. And the poor huntsman, whose duty it was to stay with the hounds, he felt that he'd have to follow the hounds. He jumped the horse into the river, and the horse was being swept away in the big flood. But there was a man over on the bridge looking at him, and he saw him in trouble, and he ran around and he jumped in and he swam across the river, and he grabbed the man and he pulled him out. He was a very poor man, but he did that, and the wealthy man that he saved and got him out, he said, "I look after you, you'll never have a poor day again." And he didn't. He became a very wealthy man afterwards.
Were any local fairs held around and about?
Oh yes. In my young days, fairs were very popular. But they were held in the towns. In my young days, there was a monthly fair every month in Cashel. There was a monthly fair in Thurles. And in all the towns there was a monthly fair in Prairie and all the other towns. And the people would have to be up early in the morning, because they'd have to have their cattle into the fair by about 6 o'clock in the morning on a fair day. And the people from around Boherlahan would have to drive their cattle to Thurles. They would have to be leaving with their cattle about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they'd have to drive them all the way to Thurles. You wouldn't have to get up so early to go into Cashel, but you still have to be in about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, because the fairs were always held very early. And the reason why they had to be held early was because when the cattle were sold, they were taken away, and they were always taken, in most towns there was a station. There was a station in Cashel where the train came in, and the cattle would have to be down about 10 or 11 o'clock down to the station to be loaded up on the train to be taken off up to Dublin and across every place through the country, and that same way in Thurles, and that's why they had to be held so early in the morning.
Was luck money given when an animal was sold?
Oh yes, yes. When you bought animals, you always expected a luck penny, because it was called a luck penny, because if you got a luck penny, that would bring you luck. In other words, you'd be lucky with the cattle. The cattle would get on well. You see, if you hadn't luck, what would happen? They might get sick, they might die. But the luck penny, they believed that if you got a luck penny, you would be lucky with the cattle, and they would never get sick, and they'd get fat very quickly.
Did older people tell you about food before your time?
Well, they would tell you about it, like, you know. But I suppose there wasn't that great change. Of course, I tell you what, they had much less food, and they had a smaller choice of food. And if you go back to my grandfather's time, they hadn't any of the choice things you have today. Do you know what they ate? They ate what they called praties, and very little else. Sometime, at one particular time after the famine, they would have two meals of praties in the day, and that was their day's food. I should also tell you, of course, that they had another very special food that they had at special days. And do you know what they called it? They called it praties and point. You see, in the little houses, they used to have to kill a pig for the old landlord up in the mansion. And they'd have to cure the pig by hanging it up on the chimney to smoke the bacon for the old landlord. And they daren't eat any of it themselves. And when they'd sit down to dinner with their praties, they'd take a potato and they'd point it up at the bacon, and they'd eat it. And you know what they called it? Praties and point.
Was the table in the centre of the floor or by a wall?
Well, I'd say it depended on the kitchen. They put it in the most convenient place. Of course, they could always pull it out from the wall at dinner time so that the people could sit all around it. And they usually sat on long stools at either side of the table. And of course, they had the sugan chair. Now, you're sitting there, stand up, you're sitting there on a sugan chair. See the sugan? Now, that was the type of chair that they used when I was a kid. Mostly sugan chairs. Now, isn't it very comfortable?
Yes.
Yes.
Was table ever hung up when not in use?
Now, in some houses that was done, where they would hang up the table to give room. The kitchens were quite small. But what they also had, they had what they called a settle bed. Because there were maybe a good lot of people in the house and they wouldn't have that many rooms. And a settle bed was kind of like a wooden stool. And at night you could open the lid of it, and it opened out and made a kind of a wooden bed out of it. And you could put a mattress on it, and they slept there at night. And then when the fellas, the young fellas, they usually slept and the set was called a settle bed in the kitchen. And when the young fellas got up in the morning, they could fold up the thing and put it away and use it as a seat then during the day.
What kind of bread was eaten in olden times?
Oh, I suppose, what did we call it? Cake bread, I think we called it. And we had what we called white bread and brown bread. Now the white bread was made mainly with flour, but the brown bread was made of a mixture of the flour and whole meal. And you had the white bread and the brown bread.
What was meat often eaten? Was it fresh or salted?
Or usually salted, because you see you couldn't have, you might have fresh meat on a Sunday, because you see the mammy might go to town on a Saturday, and she'd buy some fresh meat from the butcher's, and they'd have it on Sunday. But they couldn't have it normally during the week because they didn't have any fridges in those days. You understand? When we were growing up, we had no fridges in the house, and all the food that now that your mammies today can put into fridges, we couldn't have them in our young days. And you know why we had no fridges? Because we had no electricity. Now,
Were certain foods eaten on special occasions?
we don't think anything now. Oh yes, Christmas, of course, the turkey or the goose. Some people had turkeys always. It was a Christmas day, or if you didn't have turkey, you had a goose. Now, that was at Christmas time. Eggs on Easter Sunday. People, you see, in those days, they never ate eggs during Lent. They were always fast from eggs during. And then on Easter Sunday, when Lent was over, they'd have a big meal and they'd eat 4 or 5 or 6 eggs for their breakfast.
Do you remember any song or piece of music? Can you sing or say it?
Well, I have a poem that I wrote. Now, I wrote this poem back in the 1970s when the troubles were going ahead in the north, and when the loyalists and the papists were killing one another, and very often in the middle of it all, young children were innocently killed. And I wrote this at the time, and it describes a scene like that. And it goes like this. They met by night their plans to me, in furtherance of their cause, their motto, life's dispensable, whatever be the laws. Their weapons are the gun and bomb, destruction is their plan, ignoring in their gruesome way all laws of God and man. Tommy came from North Tyrone, he was a loyalish man, while Paddy, the papisher, lived over in Strabane. There was no outward show of hate, of that there is no doubt, yet silently each one prepared to wipe the other out. Now Pat and Tommy Junior, on their separate ways from school, had often met and chatted, though 'twasn't quite the rule. Betwixt those two wee bairns a lasting friendship grew. They swapped comics, toys and marbles, as children often do. One evening on the way from school, a thought struck wee Tommy's mind. I'll wander over to Strabane, my friend Pat's house to find. And Pat the little papisher, when his day's work was done, went off to visit Tommy's home in the hills of North Tyrone. Young Tommy introduced himself and he was welcomed in. Pat's ma said he would soon be home, he'd just gone for a spin. While Tommy's mammy welcomed Pat, you're welcome, in you come. Just wait a wee while here, son. Young Tommy will soon be home. That night a great explosion rocked the hills of North Tyrone. Yes, Pat, the holy papisher, a godly deed had done. As he lay there in the hillside, a proud and a happy man, for he had rid his country of Tommy and his clan. But Tommy wasn't home that night. He also had a plan. Soon another great explosion rocked the hills around Strabane. As he lay there on the hillside that overlooked Pat's home, he thanked his God he'd sent Pat's clan to the land of kingdom come. As the firemen searched the debris in Strabane and North Tyrone, and peaceful men all wonder why such violence we condone, a sad discovery they made, in death serene and calm. Tam's mum held wee Pat in her arms, Pat's mummy held wee Tam. Two women screamed to heaven as the explosion rocked the sky. My God, what have you done? You've sent your sons to die. And two young boys, with dying gasps, before the final knell, sent each one to the other a sad and last farewell. Two bodies small are lowered to the earth from which they came. Two lonely men are standing by, heads bent in grief and shame. For each in his endeavour to do a deed so brave has sent his own dear loved son to a cold and lonely grave. As little Pat and Tammy play in the land beyond and the heavens up above, and we pray God to enlighten men so destitute of love. Let's hope for the reality, not just an empty dream, that we'll all stand together, Lyle, neath the orange, white and green.
Any account of a connection between your local area and any episode of Irish history?
Well, there were lots, I suppose, but one that comes to my mind is an area down near Sinone. It's called Fornavara. Now, the name Fornavara comes from the Irish words Park Namarav, the field of the dead. And the story is, and I believe it's true, that there was a famous battle fought back there in the early years of the Normans, when, I don't know, was it Donogh O'Brien or some of those famous Irish were involved with the Normans, and there was a famous battle fought down in that area, and they were actually relics of that, like guns are found in more recent years. They were found and somebody was digging there that go back to that. And because of a lot of people had died in that battle, the place became known as Fornavara, the field of the dead.
What changes in the area over the years have you noticed?
Well, now, in my long life, I've noticed a lot of changes. Noticed a lot of changes. When you come to think about it, in my younger days, since I was a young fella, I'll tell you some of the changes we had. The first one was the radio. We had no radios, and then we had a radio, and we could listen to a radio, and we thought it was magnificent. But then after a number of years, we got the television. And little did we ever think that we would be able to see pictures from faraway parts of the world. And so went on and on and on like that. But I think one of the greatest inventions of all was, what do you call it? The iPod, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the greatest inventions of all. And when I see what the youngsters now can do with the iPods, it amazes me what they can do and what they can find out. With just a little tiny little
Screen.
3x2 little yoke that you hold in your hand. And we knew none of these things. So all these changes have took place since I was a boy. And even your daddy, a lot of the things, he hadn't an iPod when he was a young fella. And if he got out at night and a car broke down, he wouldn't be able to ring anybody because he didn't have a mobile phone. And he might have to walk home. That's the difference now that we've had in all these years. So there you are.